Hello everybody, Kemo Sabi here, coming at ya with another video. So this write-up is off of Global Research webpage, CA, and a write-up by Jim Miles, published June 22nd, 2019, and with the topic of the sorry state of Canadian democracy. With Canada Day and fall elections approaching, it is discouraging, to say the very least, to contemplate the deplorable condition of the body politics in our nation and the pathetic lack of awareness of its citizenry regarding the state of our environment and our extremely dysfunctional democracy. Plutocracy in reality, actually. We have absolutely no reasonable choices in our upcoming elections, as all the four parties are captured proxies of the oligarchy. We desperately need a viable alternative to the status quo because we're running out of time to right the ship. Are people going to wake up in time to save our country? In spite of the writ not having been dropped, Canada is already in full election mode. Of course, politicians are always electioneering, as their main purpose once in power is to stay in power in order to reap its rewards and benefits. Otherwise, instead of politicians running the country, we should simply let the bureaucrats do their celebrated mundane work of the daily running of the country. Unfortunately, it is not that simple, as the rules and policies the bureaucracy follows are put out by various political parties, massaged and manipulated over time, and not put on the basis of universal values or constitutional values, whatever they may be. In the meantime, electioneering has started with the many policies, plans, promises, platitudes, and homilies being announced for consumption by the incumbents and wannabes. Within domestic affairs and identity politics are many topics used to shape and steer discussions in attempts to sway the popular will. What is seldom discussed and very little understood are the actions and belief systems that really underlie our society. In a broad perspective, Canada's position as a neoliberal austerity imposing capitalist member of the Western elite, the Western US-sponsored empire, is seldom, if ever, questioned. It is seldom discussed because the true powers that be, the elite powers of those within the Washington consensus group of institutions, the bankers, financial officers, and corporate managers of the large private and public businesses and institutions, do not want it discussed. They do not want democracy to be more than a superficial status. Their control of monetary policy, their centralized control of the media, steers the world the way they want it to operate and be perceived, making our democratic institutions essentially a rubber stamp for their economic dominance. Our institutions operate within the perimeters acceptable to the corporate greed towards ever-increasing profits at the expense of the global environment and at the expense of the global citizenry. While science has long warned about climate change, the environmental pollution of all kinds, a very rare occurrence, even though those who pay attention to it are so entwined within society's structures that very little is done about these scientific concerns. Along with that, part of the same underlying paradigm are increasingly vast disparities in income and wealth levels, both domestically and in other countries. A small group of super elite control vast amount of wealth and thus power, generally working together to secure their realm. If this broad, if somewhat short generalized view is used as the lens through which to view Canada's political parties, There are rather few underlying differences between the parties, as seldom if ever are the underlying factors questioned. Essentially, it all comes down to maintaining the status quo of Western financial dominance of the world, its resources and people. The liberals and conservatives both actively support the military-industrial complex, that is, the not-so-hidden fist keeping or trying to control the world's governments. Perhaps they present it differently. The conservatives wanting to put the military out to punch above its weight, while the liberals soften the blow with rule of law and the peacekeeping forces, both serving the empire well. Few question it. From Afghanistan, Yugoslavia, Libya, Syria to Ukraine, Canada willingly supports the empire. Venezuela reveals the ultimate ugliness of it all, as Canada has for decades, with notable such as Ben Roswell and Alan Culham, former ambassadors, and Chrystia Freeland, current foreign minister, openly advocating the overthrow of a duly elected government. How democratic. Israel serves as another example as an empire under non-democratic control. A government that denies 20% of its population the same civic status as the ethnic religious majority, that guards 1.8 million people in an open-air prison on survival rations only, and that has created a series of military-ruled or controlled bantustans, if not democratic. Yet there is no Canadian political party that decries this situation, all fearful of the domestic religious vote, Christian and Jewish, and the repercussions of not supporting the empire's outpost in the Middle East. For the latter, it is truly not so much fear of what might happen, but an overwhelming blind willingness to support the dominant power of the West. All major parties, Liberals, Conservatives, New Democrats, and Greens, support the fully outdated position of wanting a two-state position, where Israel continues to ignore all of those dead positions and continues building illegal settlements on occupied territory where the rest of the world turns away. Israel is not the only place where Canadians uphold the status of the West's military control of wealth and resources. Throughout Africa, though much of the Middle East, Canada's military business connections help maintain the extraction of wealth through current supranational corporate models of governments, so-called free trade agreements, onerous World Bank predatory lending, and IMF structural adjustment programs. Debt and more debt maintains control of many governments and many supposedly sovereign economies. In essence, globalization is about controlling the world's wealth while guarding the people, the workers, laborers, behind sovereign borders. Canada is in full partnership with all of this. Blowback, refugees, poverty, and the environment. Obviously, all is not well with globalization, as millions of people attempt to escape the worst of its violent dangers and impositions. The large displacement of people in the Middle East and Africa is placing pressure on Europe as refugees continue to arrive en masse when escaping domestic mayhem. The same holds true in the Americas, as thousands of Hispanic/indigenous people attempt to travel to the U.S. in order to escape the violence and corruption and dispossession at home. Most of that violence is caused by the economic impositions of globalization, combined with the history of U.S. interventions to control governments that objected to U.S. corporate dominance. Blowback from globalization also has an impact on the Canadian domestic scene. Hyped-up fears of terrorism has increased the powers of the security state, with much learned from Israel's control of its Palestinian population, and increased the unjustified glorification of the Canadian military both through the media and with a larger budget. Canada is a member of the Five Eyes, the family members inheriting the British Empire and who now share information and security methodologies. Another form of blowback are the heightened fear of terrorism other mainly focused on refugees with a Muslim background, but extending out to the created fears generated by identity politics. These fears and prejudices Pugistes, I'm having trouble pronouncing that, are used in different ways to control the domestic electorate. A division from reality of the overall non-democratic governments of the military, finance, corporate powers. Two other perspectives can view the same phenomenon: income disparity/poverty and global environmental change. Most everyone pays lip service to poverty. Many offer solutions on a small scale through NGOs acting on small targeted goals in specific areas. Actions that certainly aid a small number of people, but in no way address the source of poverty. Musicians sing about it, politicians talk about it, the media keeps us focused addressing the underlying causes, and note, poverty does not equate to terrorism until the base structures of Western globalization are deconstructed or contained or collapse. Poverty will continue its destructive pathways: malnutrition, starvation, poor health, serfdom, wage slave labor, exploitation, etc. Poverty, other than small domestic pockets, many of Indigenous people, does not register on Canada's domestic political scene. However, climate change and global warming do have an impact. At this point, it is mainly different parties and different jurisdictions arguing about how to control carbon output using some form of establishment acceptable monetary initiatives, cap and trade, carbon tax, exploiting from the current trends. All that money maneuvering will have little impact due to the nature of our profit-oriented consumer culture. As one small but important factor, consider Canada's export of garbage, plastic waste, and e-waste to poor, less developed countries in Southeast Asia. Those outlets now are closed, and very little of our waste/garbage is actually recycled or reused. Most is incinerated at 1400 degrees Celsius, with the subsequent volatile gases dispersing through the atmosphere. Canadian consumer culture continues its money habits of purchasing stuff and planned obsolescent stuff, continuing the degradation of the environment both from chemical pollution and carbon-induced warming. Global warming, while obviously important and becoming more and more a political and media talking point, hides the dangers of thousands of chemical products behind a smokescreen, quite literally. Canadians who think they are green and want to eliminate poverty need to consider the following. Are you really willing to accept the huge changes necessary in order to achieve a clean, sustainable world, i.e., far less consumption, less travel, less stuff, no more debt purchases? The latter is very difficult, because while the wealth of the top elites has risen dramatically, wages has stagnated over the past several decades. Simply using the 3 R's will not do it unless the reduced aspect is taken to its necessary full extension. Consider also Canada's military. Can you recognize our actions in Libya, Syria, Ukraine, and maybe soon Venezuela and Iran as being part of the U.S. corporate elites striving for full control? Do you support Canada's role within the globalization paradigm of controlling other countries' economies through predatory financial practices, up to and including the use of mercenaries to protect corporations against the indigenous protests? Do you support the U.S. military actions, overt and covert, used to maintain the economic dominance of the super elites and their global corporations? Do you support the many Western interventions in the Middle East, considering the terrorists we are supposedly fighting have been used and supplied and trained in part by Western military and political establishments? More broadly, ask what role the 800 military bases, the dozen or so carrier groups, play in attempting to subordinate the rest of the world to our non-sustainable demands. The U.S. military is the largest institutional user of oil in the world. In 2007, it ranked as the 35th largest sovereign user and ranks third globally on per capita basis. Canada is a large part of the U.S. empire and plays a large role in creating the poverty, terror, and environmental disasters around the world through our support of their military adventurism. In other words, if you support the military as it is currently used, you achieve nothing against poverty, and your green color is a veneer over the actual economic lifestyle choices you make. The veneer is readily maintained by mainstream media, the vast majority of which is owned and financially controlled by the military financial corporate elites. It combines a willful ignorance of our traditions with massive amounts of diversions. One of the main diversions includes all the propaganda associated with the various wars of control and the manipulation of the terrorist threat. The diversions extend well beyond through all aspects of consumerism, the entertainment of movies, film, television, and the internet, and all aspects through the major sports activities and on the leisure and holiday leisure and holiday consumption. As corporate profits rise and wages stagnate, consumers rely heavily on debt to achieve the advertised, propagandized ideals of the good life. All the debt, trillions of dollars, simply feeds more money and power to the controllers of a corporate financialized economy. Back to Canadian political parties. In Canada, these issues present a serious problem as to which party or candidate to support. The Liberals and Conservatives are essentially opposite sides of the same coin, both supporters of the global status quo as envisioned by the corporate powers. The supposedly left New Democrats similarly follow the status quo, are not very green, and tend to move to the right once the political dollars become a more central interest. That leaves the actual Greens, although they are not as green as they would like to be perceived, support for the U.S. actions, support for Israel actions, with no real action plan regarding environmental changes addressing our military-supported consumer society, lowers their credentials as a truly green party. The Liberals quashed their election reform agenda after realizing it could negatively affect their majority control in Parliament. In opposing moves, they announced a climate emergency, then a day later approve a $12 to $14 billion pipeline project to move tar sands, diluted bitumen or dilbit, but not oil, to an ecology-sensitive coastline. Given Canada's current economic political fight with China, it is a bit ridiculous to think China will buy more of our dirty oil. Economic health, as determined by a high-energy consumer economy, does not go together with a good environment. The Conservatives acquiesced on the lack of election reform for the same reason. They are pro-big oil, frequent climate change deniers, although a recent policy statement recognized that, yes, after all these years of working against the idea, global warming is happening. They offer no real solutions other than a variant on the inefficient cap and trade idea, but with no stated cost of implementation factors. The two smaller parties offer little. The NDP have failed to truly distinguish themselves from the two larger parties, creating policy positions frequently accepted and adopted, if not implemented, by the Liberals, and for which the Conservatives cry socialism over. The Greens have some initiatives in the right direction, but with their support of the military and of government attempts to change foraging governments, they have yet to create a policy that will change the momentum/inertia of a debt-ridden, consumer-based, media-biased, military/corporate society. Other than perhaps voting for the lesser evil of the group, a spoiled ballot or no vote at all are the better options. Hope you enjoy the write-up, everybody. Certainly an interesting one. It'd be great if you leave me some comments, and awesome if you subscribed. Kemo, Sabi out. We'll see you in the next one, everybody. Thanks. Bye.